I'll start about my presentation about object-orientated views. So my name is Aki Salmi, and that's my Twitter ID. It's Rinkkasatiainen in Finnish. So who I am, I do like to do crazy stuff. So I organize this conference called Codefreeze. I do experimental coding. Some of those is in production. I am parental effectiveness trainer, so I help parents in their communication with kids. And I'm also hiking guide. At work, I'm working for a company called Ambientia, doing programming stuff there mostly. Again, Skype, Rinkkasatiainen. Few words about future conferences, like European Testing Conference in Helsinki next February. I think that's going to be a very awesome conference for testers and developers. We're more building bridges. The other one, Codefreeze in Lapland, minus 30 degrees. We might see the Northern Lights. This is from this year's picture. For conferences, I think the biggest thing for me is when I went to open space conferences and I realized, okay, there is this law of 2 feet. So if at any point you feel like getting sleepy, it's totally fine. I don't offend. Or if you want to have a coffee or something. So the goal for this talk is to initiate discussion. So maybe not today, since we are in the quite end of the conference, but if you want to discuss with me on Twitter or if you want to see the code later, we can have hangouts and all sort of things. So if you want to discuss, I'm free for that. And basically this idea that I'm presenting was introduced by Avri Grimm in the book Object on Rails. A very nice book about things that you can do in Rails. So what I'm going to show you, it's a real production code. It's a real thing that is used by thousands of people daily. So this was a real experimental coding, and I did experiment, and I did end up into the solution I'm having now. Controllers, like this. That's a single method to get a resource and to render it. That's a single index action in the Grails controller that does quite many things. So it does quite many things. Notice font size is 4 for me to get it into one screen. So we don't talk about that today. So let's assume that we are working with thin controllers. And then again, we have seen views like this. That we have if statements in views. So we are saying, okay, if a user has profile picture, show the profile picture, else show the default profile picture. So other thing, how to deal with that. So that was basically the Avri Grimm's book about. So code I've written myself. Again, this is the code I'm writing. All the code are from the same project. Controller. My code that I've written, not much better. But we get into a deeper dive here. So what I did was, basically I went through the parameters. I fetched the parameters from the requests. I did build the model. I did get the model from a service or repository. I did build the context that is given for the view then, and then I did render it, or I rendered it. So there was one if statement there. There is catch though. One of the render methods there said, okay, render 1, 0, or many blocks. So it was Confluence blocks, so Confluence news. And it rendered those based on types. Basically, there is instance of code there. Yuck. And also, I did build different domain entity to which it actually is going to render. And it actually did build different context. And it did render different templates. So a sort of violation of single responsibility principle. And what it was, so what I did there was I did build the parameters, I did build the context actually in 2 places on that code. I did build a domain entities, missing the entity, and I did render different data differently based on the domain entity. So I try to visualize what I did. So in the controller, I did ask for a domain object from service or repository. I did get a domain object, and then I did render 0, 1, or many entities. It sort of works. Since most of the bugs introduced were on this behavior of the system, on this class or concepts introduced when building this, and especially with all the nulls. So how about this all in 10 lines? And that's basically the story I'm telling. So what if the controller would work like this? So it would get a domain entity, a representation of a domain entity, and it would just tell it to a view, OK, please render this. So controller would basically build the model, render a view template, and let someone else to actually figure out which is the real template to render, whether it's a template for 1 blog post or 0 or many blog posts. And here comes the pattern exhibit that Audi had in his book. So basically the idea is that I want to build the model. I don't get a model, I get an exhibit of the model, which I then I give that to the view to render, or the view template to render, and then the view actually says to the exhibit, sends a message to the exhibit, OK, render yourself. And then the exhibit knows how to render itself. So how does this actually work? We'll get into code soon. So this is actually how I started. So I made these couple of design decisions. So I don't use nulls, not a single null in the code. I did separate read model and the write model. I did use first class collections. Do you know what a first class collection is? That basically means that instead of list of groups, I create an entity of a group list that wraps the list of groups. So it's an entity, it's a model that has behavior that might be the same as the list has, or it might be different. So the example with the group would look like this. So I had a interface of a read or write model. Then I had different interfaces for read model and write model. Basically, I wanted to separate those things, so that in certain parts of the code, I would only use read model interfaces, and certain part only write model. Then for a group, and I had the same for users, I know many of these. I had a descriptor for write model, then I had entity for the read model, and I had a list for read model. And if we go into the group entity and group descriptor and see how those are different, is that the group entity that's immutable. Everything is final there, of course, and it has behavior. The group descriptor, on the other hand, it's only public properties, basically. And if there is behavior, there is very, very little of behavior. And why this? I found it very easy to generate descriptors directly from JSON if I did it like this. So it was like very easy way for me to create a descriptor then, which will be saved into a database using different entities for that. And for the group entity, so there is a group, just a group, and there is another group that doesn't exist yet. So there was this null pattern thingy to which I did give a name. And thinking about the group list, the only behavior of that first class collection is to iterate. Now into the exhibits thing. So that was what I started from. And then at this point I realized that while doing this, that maybe I could get rid of these if statements from controllers and views. And then I came up with, since I remembered this book from Audi Grimm, so I decided I'll try this out. So an exhibit, this is from the book, wraps a single model instance. It's a true decorator. So every message that it doesn't understand, it sends it to the decorated model instance. And it brings together the model and the context. The thing is that actually why it's different than presenters or decorators is that it encapsulates the decision about how to render an object. So this is the place who actually knows how to render something. And it can consist of an exhibit can be a composite exhibit. So exhibit B can hold an exhibit A, and that can hold a model object. So talking about the group lists and groups, so this is basically how I ordered the thing. So I did create different exhibits for a group list. So the responsibility for a group list exhibit would be to render group lists. So if I fetch data and I get a list of groups, it would go to that exhibit, and that would render the data and know how to render a list of a group list. Then there is, if I ever want to edit the group, I go to a page where I want to edit the group. I get from the service, I get a group descriptor, and the exhibit knows that, okay, if I get a group descriptor, this exhibit is the one that actually gets rendered. And that makes all the editing and creates the form for that. And there is a group exhibit, a group with a picture, or there could be a group that doesn't exist in the system yet. So those are based on like the read model of the group entity. And as I said, the idea, what I just said, so the exhibit knows what is the actual view that is being rendered. When I did that, I realized at some point, well, actually, this does map quite nicely to the REST view. So getting a get to a foo, I get a list of foos. So I get a foo list, and then it's okay, easily to render. I just render a list of foos. If I want to create a new foo, so I go to foo.foo/new. I get a foo descriptor from the domain, and then it knows, okay, now I need to render this so that I can create a new foo. And same for if I want to edit it. And this is how I did it. I did use Java, and now I realized that I didn't have one of the slides where I actually had I just removed the slide. But this is the way it's done in Ruby, in the book. So basically, how I do create build the exhibits is that I take a list of all the possible exhibits, and then I say to all these possible exhibits that, do you know how to exhibit this model? And if the answer is yes, then it wraps it, and it passes itself to the next exhibit in the list. So time for some code then in the Confluence plugin. This is basically one of the views that I'm using. This renders basically either a list of groups, it shows the details of a group, or it shows a form for me to actually start changing or editing the group or creating a new group. The controller, well, this is the way basically the Confluence works. So here was the exhibit, method exhibit here, that actually calls the exhibit method here in the Confluence controller. So basically the idea is, again, get model. So in this case, it gets all the groups. So it creates basically a group list entity. And then it uses exhibit factory to build an exhibit. So as I said, if I want to see the code, horrible code that I've written earlier, which was font size 6, now I could get it in roughly 10 lines. The exhibits in themselves, there was this was in Java, so I made this static method is applicable to an object, and this was the way of exhibit knowing that, okay, do I render this domain object? This is for group not found. Then there is an exhibit for group list, and here you see it adds, okay, actually you need to render that partial when this exhibit is being rendered. These do look quite simple. Either it just says, okay, is this of the right type? Is this a group entry descriptor? And if it is, then I want to render the edit template of the group. And the same here if it's like the read model of the group. Getting back to the picture. So the controller did get a model, did ask for a model from the service or repositories. It didn't get a domain entity, but it did get an exhibit. Then it said to a view, okay, render this exhibit, and the view itself said, okay, exhibit, do render yourself, and then that would actually render the template. So here are a couple of pictures. So this is not a group, this is a personal, the user part, since there is nicer things to show here. So with this way, I could add something in the surroundings of the template. So I could add stuff above, stuff below, and to make it visually nice. And the exhibit templates are shown below. And especially in this case, the exhibit template did have two exhibits. So either remote picture, which means that it's a picture that you get from somewhere else, or it's a default picture that, okay, use Confluence own picture that Confluence stores somewhere. And the user profile exhibit there, it actually could be formed of 3 different exhibits, if I choose to do so. So that was visually the thing which I did. Did it work? Okay, there are no issues in production with this code, with this exhibit code part. And though it is not easy to grasp, it might surprise people. Okay, where is this thing actually being rendered? How it's rendered here? Why it's rendered here? It's not easy to grasp the flow of things. Some of the things which I did not show, but was like core of my designs, which I did transform the domain entities, like from the request, meaning that if I send a post request. So how I transfer the post request model into a write model and then into a persistence model, and the other way around, if I want to read entity from persistence layer, how I create one sort of model first, and then how I turn that into write model, and from then on to read model. And also the composite exhibits, I didn't show you example of that, like in the code how to show 0, 1, or many concepts dynamically. So that was basically some of the experimental coding which I had with exhibits. So I started with some design decisions that I tried to avoid nulls. I did use first class collections. I did separate read and write model, and it ended up into trying this. One thing I sort of forgot to say. So if you think this is totally mad and crazy and I would never ever do things like this. I also appreciate thoughts like that. I don't get offended of that. So this is what I did. This is what I did. This is what I am. That's not me. So if you disagree with that, you don't disagree with me. Any other questions? Comments? Thank you.